We'd like to welcome everybody today for another Sunday afternoon class. This is evaluating the accuracy of entries in the FamilySearch Family Tree. You may be slightly aware if you've been working with the family tree most recently, you may find that there are some ways to evaluate. Now, there's some ways to show what you think is good and what you think is not so good. And there are some limitations on it, and we'll have to understand how all that works. And I just kind of want to start out. There's a lot of negative things said about the FamilySearch Family Tree, about changes and about it's not accurate and on this kind of stuff. Well, there is a reason for that. It's something that goes along with having a community tree that's open to anyone particular. There's no real restrictions as long as you register, and there's nobody out there, acting like the police. So it's just a matter of the users themselves coming to agreements on the accuracy of the entries. So basically, the main problems arise from a narrow category of people in the family tree where there are considerable differences of opinion. And the opinion comes from knowing more about the family tree. Some people know how it works, some people don't know how it works. Some people think what they have is correct, and other people know that it's not correct. And so there's lots of back and forth here. In addition to that, you kind of have to understand that the family tree is really old. It's a new innovation. It's a way of looking at information that's been accumulating for well over 100 years. And so, I mean, if you were living in a house and accumulating things for 100 years, you might have to clean house occasionally, and that's sort of where we are with the family tree. We have a lot of things that fall into the category of housekeeping. Now, FamilySearch has made some progress in addressing the changes issue with some newer features. And it's not like there's going to be kind of big doors that are coming down, security doors that go, no, that's not the idea here. And that's that they're going to use the persuasion and things that are not really obviously intended to do what they do. And one of these is understanding some of the new programs that are coming out, and they are located here. And this is called the FamilySearch.org Labs. And this is where the new programs are. And so you can turn on the experiment, and then you can go to the experiment and see that. And if you turn that on in Labs, then it comes on in your view of the FamilySearch Family Tree. So you can use that particular feature. Some of these features have moved from the Labs into general usage on the FamilySearch Family Tree also. And all along, since the introduction of the FamilySearch Family Tree many years ago, there has always been a need to tell which entries are valid, accurate, documented, which should be left alone, and which are inaccurate and need to be corrected. So it's just a matter of learning and background and a little bit of sophistication in understanding what things are changed and what things may not need to be changed. And so we're looking at kind of information. Now, you can see right here, this is an example, and I use this example. By the way, this person, who is my great-grandfather, was used as the example at the introduction of the FamilySearch Family Tree back many years ago, back at the Roots Tech, one of the beginning Roots Tech meetings. I may have been the first one. And I was sitting there watching Ron Tanner, who was the person then, and turns out to be one of my cousins. And he pulled this up, and it was my great-grandfather and his great-grandfather. So that's how this got to be kind of one of the people that show up a lot in presentations and things that are talked about the family tree. But right here, you can see that there are a few sources and a few memories. Some people think that when they have 3 or 4 memories, well, that's great. And they have 2 or 3 sources, that's great. Documenting a person's life is a little bit more involved than a couple of photographs and maybe 1 or 2 recordings or something. And so this is kind of an unending thing. You can continue to add sources. The source, the total number of sources is like 1,000 sources. So you can keep adding sources until you've really generally totally documented. Another thing that's very interesting about this entry for Henry Martin Tanner in the FamilySearch Family Tree is that in the predecessor to the family tree, which was called new.familysearch.org, he was one of the people that was changed most frequently, and just hundreds and hundreds of changes going on all the time because there were so many descendants from him that had slightly different information. And so they always thought their information was more correct than what's there, and therefore they need to change it and put it in. And so there was a kind of a lot of things going on over the years now. And if people wonder about this process, once this was documented and had the basic information here, we may get a question or a something added maybe once every year to Henry Martin Tanner's. So from the standpoint that from my standpoint, watching the family tree, I'm not seeing a lot of changes in the core people that I have going back 6 or 7 generations. It's only when I get back to people who are sort of on the fringe of my core people in the family tree that I start to see a lot of changes. Now, you may run into different circumstances. It's very obvious that some people, from the minute they put something in, they're in a battle going back and forth to who can keep the entry correct and in their particular opinion of what is correct. And so that can happen. But it's usually just a situation where more documentation, more sources, more collaboration, and more memories will basically kind of flatten that out. And so that's been the core experience here. Now, what's interesting is this is the new innovation from FamilySearch Family Tree, is being addressed with the quality score. And here's the quality score. And we'll get into that just a little bit. That's appearing, and there's some, and I'll tell the parameters of where this is showing up now. And it will probably continue to show up in more and more across the tree as it's being developed. But it's something that's been very well received. And when you say that something has a high quality score that has some specific definition. There's some specific things you learn about how it works. So here on the right-hand side is the breakdown. When you look at the quality score, this is what you get. You get this sidebar, and it shows you with stars. And most of us are probably familiar with star systems, on stars from everything from YouTube videos to Costco to any place else, Amazon stars. And so this is just the star system. And it's something that's been asked for by me and others for years. Now here it is. It works. And here it says that there's more data that could be added. So maybe we could go back in and see what else is missing. It says it has tagged sources, which means they've been tagged to individuals who are identified in the source. And that's 5 stars. And it's consistent with the sources. Well, there may still be some inconsistencies. And data is conflict-free. See, it's not perfect, but it has a very good high score. And because it has a high score, there's a list of things that could improve the quality score on here on the right of the right. And it's saying things like a burial date is missing a day, a residence place is missing a city, things like that. I mean, they're minor things, but they're the kinds of things that help us to in a sense, perfect the entries that we have in the FamilySearch Family Tree. Well, think about it. Here it is. It's going to tell you. And if they tell you that there's no possible score, that means that these people are having some problems. And if their score is very low, then you know that there's a lot of stuff that's missing that needs to be added. So you can read, and my suggestions is if you can read, you can get the idea that the suggestions made should be observed and followed. In other words, here's what you have that could actually contribute something, rather than adding in a new child, missing child or something that you think is a missing child. This is in Sidney Tanner, that's not a problem, but in Henry Martin Tanner, there's a name of a Tanner who gets added as a child continually, and actually is not a child, but a kind of cousin relationship person that somehow got in the loop as someone thinking it was a child. So this is, there's things like that get in there locked in. So high means that this person is well documented. Consider spending time documenting other people. So that's the suggestion from the FamilySearch, and kind of mirrors the suggestions that we've made over the years, meaning all of us who collaborate with each other and talk to each other about these particular problems. And there's another Learn More tab here that takes us to an explanation of the profile quality score. And it explains the whole deal. And if you go on a little bit further, it asks some frequently asked questions. So it might be interesting for you to read through this so you understand what this 5-star and 4-star and 1-star and no stars is trying to say. And the limitations right now are that the user language is to English. We don't have this apparently for other languages yet. Ancestors must be born between 1800 and 1920. And the ancestor must be born in Canada, continental Europe, South America, and United Kingdom, or the United States. And that your experiment's enabled. And you have to enable the experiment for it to show up. So these are the kinds of things that are there. And this is the limitation right now. Now, if this seems to be accepted and seems to be working and doing what it's intended to do, you can always give feedback, by the way, to FamilySearch. There's tabs on the side of the windows that show up that say feedback. And there's a community where there's discussions going on about every conceivable issue you can possibly think about with the program. And so it's, you can get involved in that, and you can get involved in that discussion, and that's perfectly open. It's the community. And if you go to the little question mark at the top of the page up there on your pages and click on that, you'll see a link to the community. And that's how you get to giving feedback and getting in the discussions about the various things. And you could get into a discussion about the profile quality indicator, which is a nice way of putting it. And once again, the ancestor has to be born between 1800 and 1920. Why is 1800 the cutoff? Well, the reason is that not only is it very difficult to tell the quality of an entry before 1900 because of the lack of extensive documentation in most cases. You may have a very high quality entry that only has 2 sources or 3 sources or just less than 5 or whatever. And that's just every record that's ever been found about that person. And so using stars to rate all that kind of a situation is probably not as appropriate. So it's probably a good idea that it starts 1800. Unfortunately, most of the people who are listed in the family tree who are being subject to constant changing, which I call revolving door ancestors, are before 1800. And that there's a reason for that. And that's because their records are not as extensive. There's a great drop off at around 1800 before into the 1700s and more in the 1600s, and of course, nearly evaporates in Europe in the mid 1500s for the common people. So here's an analysis of what's going on. In this case, I'm going to use Francis Cook. Now, Francis Cook just happens to be one of the Mayflower passengers. And you can see that he has an about birth date. That's because after more than 100 years of research by the Mayflower Society and their research into all of the Mayflower passengers and all 5 generations descendants of the Mayflower passengers, all of that information has been poured into the family tree. And yet there are so many people with differing information that they have not ever sourced and have never looked at the sources that documents all of the Mayflower passengers. And so therefore they think their information is more correct than the Mayflower passengers. Now there's a second level that's been added to the FamilySearch Family Tree for alerting people of that, alerting people that there's really a lot of documentation here, folks. This has been worked on for many, many years, and just, knock off trying to make changes here. So this is this notice that's right here in red, not really red, sort of a reddy red, that says important research has been done on this person. Please read these alert notes before making changes. Okay. And I would guess that there were that what I'm watching when I see the number of changes that are going on for these people is that people are not reading the alert notes before they make the change. They just simply ignore this. They ignore the sources, and they ignore the notes that are extensive with explaining how you find information for the Mayflower passengers. And your chances of finding information for a Mayflower passenger is 0. There is no chance that you can find that information. The only way you could find that information is if you decided to become a full-time genealogical researcher specializing in English research, and you spent many years sitting over in English libraries looking for additional information about 1 or 2 people on the Mayflower. And there are people that have done that, and from time to time there are additions made to the books, but they are very, very scarce. And all the information. Oh, did I mention that all of this has been published in a set of books called the Silver Books? And they are there's a book for each of the Mayflower passengers. So the quality store is not available. Obviously, this person who lived in 1583 is long before the 1800 cutoff. But there is this note that alerts people. How do you get the note? Well, basis. And this is my note on it. He has memories and the sources, but he's still being changed. And my comment is, if there were a FamilySearch Family Tree police, you would get a ticket for making changes to this person. So that doesn't happen. There's no such thing as tickets, but that was my kind of concept, that you're really kind of doing something that's outside of the parameter of working with people on the family tree. So basically, you can add a note. And this is a note that you add to whatever. And when you add that note, you fill in this little note form. And then up there at the top, there's a thing that says display an alert at the top of the page. So if you put your note in here explaining why this person should not be changed and what kind of sources, and that changing the name or adding a child or whatever it is that's the problem, and you explain that in your note, and then you click the little note thing and then publish your note or save it, you'll notice you can write real long notes because there's like 10,000 characters here. But you can alert the note. The alert note will put that red bar at the top. So for what it's worth, that's where that red bar. Now, I don't know that there's any consequences for making changes when there's a red bar, and I don't think there are, but it may help persuade some of the people who are more adept at understanding what's going on in the world. So the first level of determining the accuracy of any entry, this is the first level. Now we're going to talk about how we're going to actually determine if this information is accurate or not. The first level of determining the accuracy is to look at the sources listed and actually read and understand every single source. Okay. Let's say you discovered that you were a descendant of Sidney Tanner, and you came here and you found there are 170 sources, but you said, but your file that you got from your grandmother has the information different than is on Sidney Tanner's website. Before you start changing everything to reflect what your grandmother put in, you should start reading all these sources. That means go down through the list and read everything on here from Amy Tanner Theriot and Wayne Pike and all the rest of the people. Okay, now the question might come up is, why have I have names on here? Well, it's because those names are on the FamilySearch.org website. They're on the family tree. And when you do something with the family tree, your login, whatever you designate as your login, will turn out to be that. And those of us who are really interested in doing genealogy and collaborating and talking to people, we basically use our name because that's who we are. We don't need a fishing stream sport or something going there like some kind of tag for somebody else. But anyway, so basically, we're not overly concerned about people. We've received notes and comments and things regularly, and it's not a problem for us. Okay. And if you don't like it, if you don't want people to talk to you, then use something that doesn't reflect what your name is. You can. It doesn't have to be your name. Okay, so you do this. What I mean is by this is read these sources. That's 170 sources. That means go through every one of these sources to see what kind of information's there, and then come to the conclusion that what you have is an addition to or adds information to what is already there. So before you even think about adding or changing anything on this person, do that. And here's the other problem, of course, is that, as we mentioned, as we go back in time, I mean, here we're right to the 1800s here with Sidney Tanner. He was born in 1809. His father was born in the 1700s. And it just keeps going back, of course, it goes back. And eventually you do get to the 1600s with the Tanners. And there's a lot of revolving door ancestors back there in the Tanners in the 1600s. For the very same reason that there's a lot of material that is totally unacceptably inaccurate because it's been around and was never verified when it was originally created. In the case of the Tanners, it happens to be a book that was published back in 1915 by someone who never even went to the place where they lived in Rhode Island and did research, just did it all by sending letters back and forth. And he didn't make any conclusions, but everybody who's read his book assumes his 3 suggested conclusions are all correct. And none of the 3 are correct, as a matter of fact. Now look at the latest changes. This would be the next step. Okay, so you check the sources, see what's there. If there are no sources, obviously it's an open field. The person may not exist, and so you may want to do some research before you do anything because you may not have the right individual. But let's look at the latest changes and see what's going on with each individual in the tree. And the latest changes, there's a little button down here at the bottom that says show all, and that'll show you all the changes that are being made on a particular individual and when those changes are being made. And so I got this one off of one of the people that I was working on, and you can see that it's fairly current, in other words. But if you get into one and you see the latest changes are like yesterday and today, and people are changing it every single day, that's what I call a revolving door ancestor. And I would suggest just simply waiting around to see if all those people are ever going to stop and ever going to read all of the sources that actually exist instead of trying to make up stuff. So you can learn how accurate a change might be from the list of all the changes. That means that if you read through here and see what's been put in, you can see that the types of sources that we're working on. We're not just working on the BMD, birth, marriage, death, and the census records. We're working on actual records that need to be researched a little more. And you'll note that one of the people understood that there was a record hand and deleted the record hand because it didn't match. It wasn't the person. And so there's, some logic going on here. If there are current changes, it's primarily because more information's been added recently. So this is Francis Cook. This is what it looks like on his change order. It's show all changes. And the given for this is that his parents are unknown. They've never been known. I learned this very early. One of the things that, traditions that was handed down to me as my family was, oh, we have a Mayflower passenger as an ancestor. Well, I didn't have a clue what that meant until I was older. But now I turn out to have more than one Mayflower ancestors, probably more than one or two. But that's just depending on how all of this finally shakes out. But I can assure you that what happened to alert me to this fact was I was getting in and seeing all of these people with long pedigrees going off the Mayflower passengers on records, on paper records in the family history library at the time. It was Family History Library in Salt Lake City, now called the FamilySearch Library. But I was sitting there looking at paper records, and the paper records went back. Some of them went back to the 400s and 380s and things like that from these people. And then I was walking down the shelves, which I do constantly when I'm in a library, and there was a book, a little thin book about an inch thick that I pulled off the shelf, and it said Ancestors of the Mayflower Passengers. And in that little book, it explained very closely that none of these people wanted to know who they were, wanted anybody to know who they were. And they may have all changed their names. They all moved from England to the Netherlands and then went back to leave from England and then they would have been arrested in England, by the way, because they were nonconformists and unwanted people. But then they got on the boat and came to America, and they didn't care that nobody knew who they were. And so it's very, 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 very difficult to try to prove the parentage of one of these people. And I would say that about many, many, many of the people who were in the New England area. And one of the things that's very common, you can look it up yourself if you want to verify that, is that there are estimates up to 70% or more of the male people who came to America in the 1600s and into the 1700s were indentured servants and enslaved people or transported, meaning they were transported as criminals. And many of those people had no, what you might call, genealogical background because they got here and they were illiterate. They were possibly had no idea who their parents were, or if they did, they didn't care about their parents because they were here in America. And so there's lots of barriers to trying to take the leap from the East Coast over to Europe. And that's one of the things that I've been focused on for the last few years is immigration research. And it's easily the most difficult part of doing genealogy. And that's what you're looking at here is immigrants.
James?
And so, question.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions under the chat that I thought I'd bring up now before you transition to your word to next. It says, what if we find two or more sources listed for a person that are exactly the same, example, the same census record?
Okay, there's the simple answer is this: a source tells you where the record came from. If those two records came from the same place, meaning FamilySearch or Ancestry or whatever, then they are duplicates and you can do whatever you want. I mean, if you want to tidy up things and detach one of the sources, that's fine. But if it comes from a different place, so if you have a census record from Ancestry and a census record from FamilySearch and a census record from MyHeritage, you just might want to have all those, because what if one of those or more of those disappears or you lose that particular source? Well, that's the problem. And so having sources that when you're thinking in terms of where it came from is more important. Okay.
So too much information is not a bad thing then.
No, the more you have, it's fine. The problem also that occurs is that there are different copies of the census records. The US Census record, the original image quality copies that are what you would look at if you were looking at the papers, are on archive.org, the big website that has a lot of everything.
The other question that was asked, show us again where we find changes to a person.
Oh, well, the changes is on the right-hand side. I don't have a way to go back and show that, but it's, if when you look at it, it'll say, they'll show the most recent changes, and down below it'll say show all. And you'll just click on that and you'll get a list of all the changes. Every page of every person page has that on the right-hand side in the bar that's on the right-hand side. Okay, so let's look at this. Add addition. Okay, here's where we are. We're looking at Francis Cook, who has been essentially documented more than any one other person probably in the United States and in America. And if you add parents without extensive documentation, it's nothing more than graffiti. It's just graffiti. It's just spray painting something to make your mark and say, I did this, because you're not adding any information. And so here's somebody that added this. These are father and mother to Francis Cook. They've added Edward Cook, who was born in 1531, and Alice Compton, who was born in 1548. And you have Francis Cook, born in 1583. Now, the guy's got a name. Cook's got his name there. But if you look at it, this is the mother that's added. She was born, her name is Alice Ann Compton. And if you do a little bit of research, and she was born in 1538 and died in 1615. And there's no sources, no memories, nothing. This person may as well be made up. There's no sources. Zero. So how do you justify putting a person in to add them to the organization records that are volume set? And the Francis Cook book's probably 2 or 3 inches thick with all the information about him and his descendants. And you're going to add this information with no sources. Didn't tell us why you thought that this person, other than the fact that they came up with somebody who had a name of Cook and a year that put him in the range of being able to do it. You don't even have anything here that showed that Francis Cook ever lived or was born in Essex. So that's, there's a lot of things here that you need to examine. So when I'm talking about this part of the family tree, I'm talking about the parts that may not be reliable. When you get back into these, it's not inevitable, but it's very common that as I go back on any pedigree, that I move from being in reality to fantasy or to unreality by simply having somebody put in that has no sources and having no parent-child relationship, no documentation of a parent-child relationship. So once you do that, you've separated yourself from the reality of history, and now you're adding names in based on some personal preference criteria that you've come up with. So the further back you in time, it's more difficult to find regular people. You just have to understand that the difficulty increases exponentially as long as an overused word, but it's actually applicable here. Unless you got royalty or nobility, and that, by the way, there's always this chance or idea that you can connect back to some noble person. And that's a whole different subject, and it's a whole different category of issues. And my answer when I ask the question is, yeah, kings and queens and nobles had children too, but mostly they keep track of those children because they were nobility. And if you're really in a noble family, it's very unlikely that your commoner ancestor all of a sudden became a noble person. It's possible, but not very likely. And that takes a lot of research. And there are people who have done it and clicked to noble families, and that's great to have noble families. I don't have any. I've never found even the hint of real royalty. All my ancestors turn out to be absolutely penniless in most cases. So it's just in almost all cases, very few. Okay, so here we are, and I just took some examples. These are just kind of random examples out of the FamilySearch Family Tree. And this one's I'm going to focus on is this John Foxwell up here and Joanna Robinson. He's purportedly born in 1545 and died in 1616, in his marriage in 1671, and it's in Westminster, London, and a nice place to have a wedding. And Joanna was born in 1550 and 1615, died a year before he did. And they probably had some children. And so this is just kind of your average thing. And the question is, how do you know that any of this is correct? How do you know that any of the dates or anything having to do with this particular entry are correct? Well, click on it. And then you come up with this. Okay, here's what happens when you look at the sources. He appears to have 4 sources. Now that's 4 sources. That's not bad for somebody born in the 1500s. So let's just see what we actually have here in the way of some sources. What is it that we've got here? So now we have some more information. And he was born in a birth in 1545. Looks like he was christened in 1546, but there's a little bit of problem here. He was possibly born in London in Middlesex County. That's right there in the middle of London. And Somerset, England, a little bit of ways from there. The first thing we can start to do is look for places. So now we're going to look at the sources to this. The basic information we want to know is this. And here's an interesting thing that FamilySearch does, and maybe you haven't focused on this when you've been working with the FamilySearch program. It tells you if the sources support the information. So if you look at this, all the 4 sources are simply his name. And there are no sources that substantiate any birth date or a christening date. So where did the birth date and the christening date come from? I know there's somebody here who put them in, but besides that. So all 4 sources are for the name, and none of them support the birth. That's the problem here. We don't have anything that actually shows who he was when he was born. There could be 2 John Foxwells, one born in London and one christened in Somerset. And the question is, how do you get a birth date back there in the 1500s? And birth dates, except for, once again, nobility, are not generally recorded. You get christening dates or baptism dates, which are the same thing. Christening is baptism. Birth and a birth at birth, you don't get a birth date. You just suppose that he was born sometime before the christening date. which may or may not be true, because I've seen people who were baptized into the Catholic Church or the Church of England when they were adults, because they never got baptized before, or because they couldn't prove they were baptized. So let's see what's recorded for his birth records. So there we've got our records up there. We have 0 sources. So we're going to look at the actual sources and see if there's actually something here. Well, first of all, we get a source number 1, which has a John Foxwell, which is the name, and it says that his father's name's John Foxwell, and he was born in 1573. Well, this may be a record for a son of John Foxwell, but then again, we have the problem that our 1545 John Foxwell is born in London, supposedly, and christened in Somerset. Why somebody would travel all the way to Somerset if their child was born in London, to have him christened or baptized is a real good question, especially in the 1500s, which traveling wasn't all that great. So this record isn't even him. I mean, we don't know who John Foxwell the father is. We know that this particular John Foxwell, who was born in 30 years later, was baptized or christened in Somerset. And this was on 29 August 1573, and that's John Foxwell with John Foxwell. Okay. Now we know that John Foxwell, 1545, could have a son named John Foxwell who was born. But when we look at the list, the 1575 John Foxwell, who is the son of the one that we were looking at previously, is not the one that's on that record, on the source record, because this guy was born in St. Bride and he died in London and doesn't even have a christening date. So this is the one that's actually there. The source doesn't even correspond, probably doesn't correspond to either this, to the father or the son, because the dates don't match at all and the places don't match at all, and there's nothing there. So, I mean, here's what we're up against. This is an actual 1500 source that would have had that kind of information, and that's what it looks like. So it may take you a little while to work back and get to the point where you can actually read this, but I can actually see the John Foxwell right here near the bottom. It's about the third line up. It's John Foxwell, the son of John Foxwell, etc., and that's where he was born, in Sussex. Okay, so the record there is saying that we have a John Foxwell. We're going to call him John Foxwell 1575, was christened or baptized in Somerset in 1573. Anything wrong with that? Oh, well, he was christened 2 years before he was born. And it's also nice to know that perhaps the United Kingdom wasn't in existence until 1922. And you can get into long discussions about this, but that's kind of the way that it works. And looking at the record, it turns out that the particular record came from the parish of Pitminster in Somerset. That's where this particular record that I traced back for this John Foxwell was born. His father's listed as John Foxwell, born in 1545. So this is a child's baptism, but the only John Foxwell listed as a birth rate of 1575. So the one we're looking for is 1575, and his father is listed as John Foxwell, born 1545. So there's, you're starting to get into some of the concepts and some of the problems here that you have when you actually work through these records and think about them. and not just paste in another John Foxwell that you find because you do a search for John Foxwells in the English baptisms. So here we are with what's there. And here's what's listed. Birth, 0 sources. St. Bride. Christening, 1 source. 1573. And just to give you some perspective here, Pitminster is 153 miles east of downtown London. So somebody had to travel in the 1500s, had to travel a long distance away from London to have somebody baptized. I mean, conceivably, it's conceivably possible, but it's practically, from a practical standpoint, and looking at the time frame and the distance traveled, it seems almost impossible. So it's very likely that this person who was born 2 years after his baptism is the same person who was baptized 153 miles away in 1573. Okay. Born in London, the mother traveled 153 miles. So here's the other 3 sources. That was just the first source. The other 3 sources are all for somebody named Grace Foxwell, and one other that's not anyone else is Elige Foxwell. And they're all just showing up as event place in Somerset. Just for an interest sake, if you want to get a concept of what's going on here, just go into a Google search and say, how many parishes are there in Somerset, England? And you'll find out that finding out where this person was born and christened is not as easy as writing that. Somerset, England, in 1500s. And in this case, his father was listed as being born in, and I'm doing some research here. I'm actually looking at the family tree, and I'm looking up and I'm looking at the sources, and I'm looking at the records from the sources to see if they're actually valid records. And then that's how I'm doing this. And when I get to this point, the father is this William Foxwell. This John Foxwell that we've been talking about, the 1575 Jim Foxwell, his father was supposedly born in 1520, and they have 3 sources, and all 3 of those are marriage records, and there's no record showing a parent-child relationship. So whoever Lady Joanne Foxwell Witt or Joanne Witt were related to, and whoever they married, this William Foxwell, whoever he was, we don't have any records showing that he had a son or daughter of any kind, much less one named John. So it's very likely that these names are just being taken randomly from parish registers. And they've looked up the Foxwells, and they figure all the Foxwells are related, so therefore I'm just going to throw this in. And that's sort of the problem that we have. So if we look at this pedigree, it starts from me and goes back to this John Foxwell guy. Where does the pedigree actually end? Well, there may be some opinion as to where it ends, but it certainly ends a few generations closer to the present, and probably when they launch off into the Foxwells in the last 4 generations, that probably it really ends right then, and that there probably are no more people past that have ever been documented. So it's somewhere in that pedigree, there's an end. There's a point at which nobody has the right sources that support a parent-child relationship that's shown in this pedigree. And it's somewhere in here, in this area of the Foxwells. Now, one thing that's very important to understand is I don't have to look very far or hard for examples like this. I can find them at the end of nearly every pedigree that I look at in the family tree, because this is just what's happened. It's just the time when this early research was being done it was all being done in the sense from extraction, meaning just copying names out of records and not verifying about the places or the dates or anything that happened to it. So what do I look for? And I'm going to give you a kind of real quick summary here. Is there a source-supported line of documents supporting all the parent-child relationships? So everything in the line, your pedigree line back to the person you're looking at, does everybody have documentation that is valid and makes sense, not like the stuff I've been looking at? And all the parent-child relationships are supported. Are all the places mentioned in the sources consistent with reality? We don't have any 153-mile away christenings in the 1500s. Are all the places mentioned in the dates consistent with reality? And that's another thing. They've got United States listed there, or they've got England or whatever. And you've got to figure out what the country was when the event occurred and put in the correct country. So you even begin to pick up records that are accurate. So the list goes on. There's just a lot more considerations and concerns, but it's in all the things that happen. So here we have a person named James Cole, and his father is listed. And this is just kind of my closing deal here to show you this one. His father's name is Sir William James Cole, Earl of Enniskillen, Roman numeral 3. So he's the Earl of Enniskillen, the third Earl of Enniskillen. He was supposedly born in 1570. Quick search on the family tree that has the child's birth is later than the father's death. So that's kind of a problem with this, obviously, but we won't worry about that right now. The question is, why are we adding this Sir William James Cole, who is supposed to be the Earl of Enniskillen in Roman numeral 3? Well, where did the information come from? No sources. No sources. None. Not one. By the way, the third Earl of Enniskillen was William Willoughby Cole in 1807. Born in 1807, not back in the 1500s. So I don't know where they got that, and I don't know where that idea came from, because this is who the third Earl was. So somebody just threw in an Earl, thought it was a great name, and stuck it in there with some name. So that's how it gets there. So don't step off into the fire swamp. Don't get yourself locked into all this mess of stuff. Make sure that the genealogy start with as correct as possible before you get mired down in the swamp of names that have no sources. Or don't get into a fight with people who are well documented. So if you want to work on genealogy, take some time to learn what you're doing and how to do it. Thanks.